You're listening to Desire and Power with your host, Mira Salem.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Mira, and today we're just going to jump right in because I need to start with something that genuinely made me sit there and go, what the fuck did I just listen to this morning? Because I watched this clip from one of these podcast bros, like the ones with the same lighting and the same tone and the same, I have decoded women energy, right? And this man was basically describing his love for his wife as restraint, like actual restraint from violence. Like, as in, I could hurt my wife, I could ruin her, I could destroy her, but I don't. And that's how I show my love. And he was saying it like it was profound, like he deserves a freaking trophy for not committing a crime. And I just kept thinking this whole day, like, is this really where the bar is now in our society? Really? Like, is this actually what we're doing? Because the implication underneath is so insane when you actually sit with it, right? It's basically saying that masculinity is defined by your capacity for harm, and then your virtue is measured by whether or not you act on it. So the whole identity is built around I am dangerous. And then we as a society are what? Supposed to like clap because you're choosing not to be violent? That's not depth or maturity. That is the bare fucking minimum required to function as an adult in our society. You don't get bonus points for not assaulting your partner. That's just baseline humanity. And what really gets me here is not even just that one statement and that one clip. It is how casually this entire alpha bro ecosystem treats physical dominance like it is the core of manhood. It's always about strength, physical strength, lifting more, hitting harder, being capable of overpowering someone, right? And then they also wrap it in this like warrior fantasy language, right? Like, oh, I have all this power. I'm also great, but I just choose not to use this power, and that's what makes me a good guy. Really? Like, dude, anyone with basic muscle mass has that power. That's not personality, okay? That's anatomy. And the arrogance is so wild. The way that some of these guys talk, you'd think that they're walking around like one breath away from just like leveling an entire city block. Like, relax, my guys, relax, okay? Most women are not on the brink of death because you exist in the same room as them. The inflation of self-importance is almost comedic if it wasn't so freaking toxic. And that's the thing, right? It would be funny if it wasn't being fed to millions of insecure young men who are trying to figure out what it means to be a man. Because when you repeat over and over and over again that masculine value lies in how dangerous you could be, then you fuse identity with threat. You teach boys that the core of their power is intimidation. Instead of teaching them to ask themselves, am I stable? Am I grounded? Am I somebody who people actually feel safe around? No, no. You teach them to ask themselves, could I win? Could I dominate? Could I destroy if I wanted to? That's not strength, dudes. That is hierarchy brain. That is ego inflation that you are masquerading as biology. And when that kind of rhetoric becomes normal, when it gets laughs and nods and subscriptions and follows and shares, whatever, right? It's gonna shift what is acceptable to say about women publicly. It makes threat language very casual. It makes contempt very conversational, right? It lowers the floor of decency while pretending to raise the standard of masculinity. And I am sorry. But if your definition of love includes reminding your partner that you could hurt them, even hypothetically, that's not romantic. That's unstable and unhinged. That is not alpha. That is just being insecure with a microphone. All right, now let's talk about how these guys talk about women, because this is where it gets really freaking transparent. Once you get past the whole like I could hurt you but I don't nonsense, then you realize that half of their content is literally just obsessing over what women are doing. who we're sleeping with, how many people we've slept with, whether we're loud, whether we're independent, whether we're too ambitious, too opinionated, too masculine, not feminine enough, too feminine, but in the wrong way. It never freaking ends. And I'm sorry, but the irony is insane to me. The same men who say that women are emotional and dramatic are going to spend 3 straight hours dissecting female nature like we're a freaking science experiment. That's not indifference. That's obsession. And the body count thing, like, oh my God, if I hear one more grown-ass man say that body count matters like he's auditioning livestock, I'm gonna lose it. The obsession with how many people a woman has slept with is so revealing because they pretend that it's about morality or standards or biology, but it's not. It's about control and about ego. It's about wanting to feel special and threatened at the same time. And instead of just saying, hey, I feel insecure about this, no, they turn it into some evolutionary freaking TED talk that they half understood from a YouTube clip. If your masculinity collapses because a woman had a life before you, that's not science, bro. That's just massive insecurity. Massive insecurity. Sorry, that's just the truth, right? And then we get the trad wife fantasy, right? The very quiet and submissive and soft-spoken woman whose whole existence revolves around cooking and babies and never challenging her husband. And look, if a woman genuinely wants that in her life, like good for her, whatever. But that's not what these guys are selling, okay? They're selling it like it's the only respectable option. Like if you want a career or autonomy or, God forbid, an opinion, then you're broken. And like you can feel their control underneath it all. Because when you really strip it all down, what they're saying is that women are safest when they're dependent, right? And they're talking about like financially dependent, socially dependent, emotionally contained. And then they sell that off as traditional values. But it's not. It's not traditional values. It's just wanting the power dynamic to be tilted in their favor. And it's wild to watch them talk about women being chaotic while building this entire rigid rule book about how we should behave so that they feel secure. That's not leadership. That's fear. And I think that this is what actually really bothers me the most. It's the pretending that this is about virtue and morality, or better yet, protecting women. Really? No, it's not. It's about not wanting to compete in a world where women have options. And that's a very different conversation. And once you really sit with all of that, the body count stuff, the trad wife fantasy, the whole like women should just be softer and quieter and more agreeable thing, right? You realize that it doesn't just stay in dating conversation, it starts bleeding straight into politics. It always does. Because at some point, it stops being, I prefer feminine women, and it turns into, this is how society should be structured. And this is when I actually start getting really heated because now we're not just talking about preferences anymore. We're talking about laws. We're talking about who gets autonomy and who doesn't, right? Take abortion. Okay. You can dress that up however you want. You can wrap it in religion and morality or responsibility or whatever makes it sound noble to you. Okay. But at the end of the day, if you are arguing that a woman does not get final say over what happens inside her own body, that is a power move. That is not neutral. That is not just a philosophical difference. That is you deciding where somebody's authority ends. And, and it drives me crazy, right? Because it's framed so casually, but it's so obvious. Like, it's just common sense. Like, women asking for control over their own bodies is somehow radical or hysterical. And then you drag the religion in all the time. Okay. And I'm not anti-religion. I believe that people should be free to choose whatever religion they want, but they shouldn't push it down other people's throats. Okay. But let's not pretend that That's what's happening here. Because this is only like a very specific, very political version of Christianity that gets used over and over again to justify male leadership and female submission. And somehow God always lands on the side of keeping the hierarchy intact. That's pretty convenient, don't you think? Right? And then when you zoom out, you realize it's not even just women, right? It's the LGBTQ plus community, it's immigrants, it's anybody who doesn't fit this very like tight picture of what a proper society should look like, right? And then you hear these guys and they talk about how this is about protecting culture, protecting family, protecting children. But like, what are you protecting them from? Are you trying to protect them from people living differently? Because when you scratch the surface, a lot of this isn't about protection, it's about discomfort. It's about not liking that the world has changed and not knowing where you fit in anymore. And instead of wrestling with that personally, you turn it into an ideology about rolling everything back. That's not strength. That is reacting to change by trying to freeze time. And the part that makes me want to freaking scream is that this is all getting packaged as moral courage, but it is so not that. This is control anxiety that's been dressed up in Sunday clothes. And this is where it honestly starts to feel like cosplay. Because once you've blamed women for not being submissive enough and you've wrapped that up in like family values, then your next move is always this dramatic, cinematic panic about culture collapse. And the way that these guys talk about it, you'd think that they're standing on a castle wall watching barbarians approach, right? You hear it all the time. The West is falling, civilization is dying, masculinity is under attack. By who? Target employees with pronoun pins? Like, dude, this is so theatrical. And and the thing that kills me is how serious they are while they're saying it. Like like they really believe that they're these last warriors guarding the gates of tradition and that their enemy is women having standards and gay couples existing at brunch. Like that's the apocalypse, guys? Really? Not climate change, not authoritarian governments. No, no. It's women and gay people. Yeah. And I don't even say that to like minimize change because change is real and society shifts and power structures move. But the leap from the world looks different to we must defend civilization is so dramatic that it's kind of funny. Because if your sense of masculinity collapses when women can open their own bank accounts and immigrants can move into your neighborhood, maybe you weren't defending civilization, maybe you were just defending your own convenience. Yeah. And I think that's the part that makes me want to like laugh and scream at the same time is the amount of grandiosity that is there because it's insane, right? You've got grown men with microphones talking like they're generals in a culture war. And what they're really upset about is that they don't automatically get deference anymore. That's not heroic. That's just like a toddler who realized that the world doesn't revolve around him and has decided that it's all a conspiracy. Like, that's the reason I'm laughing right now, is because the performance is so inflated compared to the actual threat. The threat isn't civilization ending. The threat is having to actually build value instead of just inheriting it from the system, right? And instead of saying like, okay, I need to adapt. No, instead of doing that, they write themselves into this epic narrative about saving the country. Dude, that's not epic. It's fragile. It's fragile as fuck. And the more dramatic you get, the more obvious it becomes to anybody that has more than two brain cells, okay? Okay, and this is where the whole thing starts looking less like philosophy and more like fantasy. Because once masculinity gets tied to dominance and once dominance gets tied to defending culture, it doesn't stay abstract. It turns physical. It turns into this constant fixation on weapons and combat readiness and being the protector, right? And I'm not pretending that this is just an American thing. This podcast circuit is bleeding everywhere right now, right? It's exported, but the aesthetic travels and the attitude travels and the rhetoric travels, and you'll see all these guys talking about strength and discipline, and within 5 minutes, it's about freaking firearms and about being ready and how men are supposed to be capable of violence if necessary. Okay, that phrase, if necessary, does so much work. Necessary for what? Nobody ever quite explains that part. It's just assumed that a real man should be one step away from confrontation at all times. And I don't think people realize how weird that is, like genuinely weird, because you're building an entire identity around the idea that your value comes from how effectively you could harm someone if it came down to it. Not that you will, not that you necessarily want to, but that you could. And that potential is supposed to be impressive. And then it gets packaged with freaking gym footage and range clips and this very intense tone, like you're auditioning for a role in a war movie that nobody cast you in. And here's where I'm gonna start laughing because the same guys who talk about being protectors spend an incredible amount of time broadcasting how armed and dangerous they are to strangers on the internet. That's not protection. That's signaling. That's performance. Real protectors don't need an audience, bro. And I think what bothers me is the fusion, the way that masculinity gets like welded into weaponry in this space. Like you can't separate the two, like strength without firepower doesn't count. That that's an entire identity that you built on intimidation. And when young men absorb that over and over again through these freaking podcast circuits, when they're told that their worth is measured by how capable they are of physical force, it does something very specific. It narrows the definition of manhood down to aggression plus restraint, which, by the way, is really not an evolved definition. It's a very ancient one. And pretending that it's revolutionary or enlightened is hilarious because all you're doing is caveman logic with a podcast mic. That's it. And when you look at that whole constant readiness performance, that intensity, that low level war energy, you start realizing that it doesn't just run on vibes, right? It needs something underneath to justify itself. You can't keep people emotionally charged like that unless they're also, being fed a steady stream of reasons to feel suspicious and defensive in the first place. And that's where the whole distrust and misinformation piece slides in. Because if everything is broken, right? If the media lies, if universities are corrupt, if all the experts are compromised, if research can't be trusted, then suddenly that heightened posture makes sense, right? Of course, you'd feel like you're living in hostile territory if you've been told repeatedly that every major institution is working against you. And what's interesting is how consistent that messaging is across this entire space. It doesn't matter which podcast you're listening to, it eventually ends up circling back to the idea that you can't trust the mainstream version of anything. And I'm not saying that institutions don't deserve criticism. Of course they do. But there's a big difference between critical thinking and just like flattening everything into it's all fake. Because once you do that, where does somebody go for information? Well, they're going to go to the person who told them not to trust anything else. And that's not the same like abstract accident. That's influence, right? If you position yourself as the only honest voice in a sea of corruption, then people are going to start leaning on you more heavily than they want to, or more than they even realize. And the tone that they use is always framed like courage, right? Like they're bravely speaking truth to power. But if you strip away all their drama, a lot of it is just very simplified narratives that are just delivered confidently. It's not deep research, it's not layered analysis, it's just emotionally satisfying explanations that make the world feel easier to understand. And that is very seductive, right? Because Complexity is frustrating for people. Real scholarship is slow. Nuance doesn't give you that immediate hit of certainty. But a guy telling you that the whole system is rigged and that he's cracked the code, yeah, that feels good. It feels empowering, I'm sure, until you realize that you've stopped checking anything outside of that bubble. And that's the part that should be concerning to everyone. Because once somebody's entire intellectual diet comes from one ecosystem that reinforces the same enemies and the same grievances, you don't have to force them into anything anymore. They'll just defend it themselves. They're going to repeat it themselves. They'll build their own whole identity around it. And that shit is very, very dangerous. And when you zoom out and you look at all of this together, right? The dominance obsession, the policing of women, the culture panic, the constant readiness performance, the distrust of institutions, then you start seeing exactly what it produces. It doesn't produce grounded men. It produces very angry ones. It produces men who feel perpetually slighted, who walk into rooms already defensive, who see disagreement as disrespect and autonomy as rejection. And when you feed that mindset long enough, it starts leaking into behavior, right? You see it online constantly. You see the harassment, the content, the way that women who speak confidently get flooded with insults, the way that LGBTQ creators get targeted, the way that anybody who challenges the narrative gets dogpiled. And that's not random, that's downstream. Okay. If you tell young men over and over that they're under attack, that society is rigged against them, that women are gold digging manipulators, that all the institutions are corrupt, that masculinity is being erased, what do you get? Eventually, some of them are going to internalize that as hostility. And I know that most won't become violent. Okay, I can be clear about that. But some of them will, and some of them are going to become deeply resentful. And resentment doesn't just disappear, right? It turns into isolation, bitterness, and it turns into this constant low-grade anger that eats away at their sense of self and makes them unstable. And that instability can be potentially even dangerous for the people around them. And the saddest part is that the very men being told that they're reclaiming power are often becoming the most fragile in the process. Because if your identity is built on being dominant, then what happens when you're not? If it's built on control, then what happens when you can't control somebody? If it's built on hierarchy, what happens when the hierarchy shifts? You don't get resilience out of that. You get volatility. And we've already seen where volatility can go when it mixes with grievance culture and online echo chambers. There has been so many harassment campaigns. We've seen real world attacks that were linked to extremism, manosphere ideology. We've seen young men spiral into communities that validate their anger instead of challenging it. And this isn't abstract. It's not just cringe internet content. It shapes how people date, how they vote, how they treat women and minorities in their lives. It shapes whether they see partnership as cooperation or competition. And what frustrates me, it, like so much, is that there are better models of masculinity available. There are men out there who are strong without being threatened by a woman's autonomy. There are men who are protective without needing to broadcast it to the world. There are men who are disciplined and educated and emotionally grounded all at the same time. But those men don't scream as loudly into microphones, and so they don't dominate the algorithm. And that is a real tragedy because underneath all of the bluster and the branding and the warrior theatrics, what's being sold to young men is a very small version of themselves, a version that feels powerful on the surface, but is constantly scanning for enemies. And that's not freedom, that's just a cage. And the master of that cage is whatever man you perceive as above you in the imaginary hierarchy that you believe in. And that's super sad, bro. That's super sad. Now, what honestly blows my mind is how deadly serious these guys are about themselves. Like they really think that they're carrying the future of masculinity because they sit in front of a mic and rant about dominance for 3 hours while selling supplements and yelling about how society has gone soft. That's not a revolution. That's a merch line with a lot of anger issues. And I'm not even mad at the loudest ones anymore because it's just predictable at this point. Like, of course they're loud. Of course they're going to escalate everything, right? Drama pays. Outrage pays. Being the guy who says the most unhinged shit on the internet pays. Okay? What actually matters now are the men who know this is ridiculous and still stay quiet. Okay? If you're a decent man and you're watching this whole circus unfold and you're thinking, yeah, this is kind of embarrassing. But then you don't say anything because you don't want the smoke, right? You don't want to be made fun of by other men or something. Guess what you're doing? You're leaving the stage to the clowns. And then the rest of us, we all have to sit there pretending that the clowns represent masculinity? Nah. No, 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 no. They don't, okay? And I'm going to keep laughing at these guys because these guys deserve to be laughed at. Okay. If your entire personality revolves around reminding the internet how dangerous you are, you're not alpha. Okay. You're just a guy who desperately needs strangers to believe that he's tough. Real strength doesn't need a freaking trailer soundtrack. It doesn't need a thumbnail with glowing red eyes and the word dominance in all caps. These bros are so theatrical. But the younger guys that are watching these alpha bros, they deserve better, okay? They deserve so much better than this caveman philosophy with Wi-Fi bullshit. They deserve to see men who are strong without being threatened by women, men who can handle disagreement without spiraling into civilization is collapsing, okay? They need we need we need men who don't need to live in permanent freaking combat mode just to feel relevant. So, to those good men that are listening right now, and hopefully you're out there somewhere, okay? This is your lane. If you care about masculinity, then start acting like it. Talk to the younger men in your life. Push back when friends say something gross. Stop letting resentment masquerade as wisdom in your own circles. Because if you don't, the loudest and least integrated voices are going to keep shaping the narrative. And no, women are not shrinking ourselves to make that easier for you guys. That's not happening, okay? We're not going back into the smaller boxes so that insecure men can feel taller. Not happening, okay? So the only option left here is evolution. And evolution is going to require men to correct men. And if this is making some alpha bros feel exposed, mm, good. Guess what? Exposure is not oppression, my guys. If your worldview can't survive a woman laughing at it and having her own opinion, maybe your worldview wasn't that strong to begin with. Anyway, look, if you made it this far, thank you for actually listening all the way through. I know this one was spicy, but I think we need a little bit of spice right now. And if you like these kinds of conversations where we actually break this stuff down instead of just pretending it's normal, then make sure you follow, subscribe, leave a review, whatever you want to do on whatever platform you're on, okay? And check the show notes because all my socials are linked in there if you want to keep the conversation going or you want to share this with somebody who needs to hear it because trust me, there's a few people that need to hear this, okay? So, I'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to hit that follow button to know when the next episode releases.